Welcome to Learn by Choice. So in this video we are going to talk about gross domestic product, and is it the right indicator for assessing the well-being of the country's population. So these are all the some of the news items which appeared in various online media and also the print newspapers about the GDP, and India is growing at 4.7%, and then five things to look out for Q3 growth number. So these news items basically focusing on the GDP and how it can be increased and what are the reasons for fall in the GDP. Before arguing about the advantages and disadvantages of the GDP for the well-being of the people, let us try to understand how the GDP is calculated. So GDP is nothing but the monetary value of the goods and services produced within the geography. For example, in India or in any country for that matter, for the specific timelines, it may be a quarter or it may be a financial year or it may be half year. So GDP indicates economic prosperity. However, this is also debatable, and GDP for a particular year is compared with the base year, and normally it is adjusted for the inflation. So GDP is one of the indicator used by the policymakers and also the business investors before making any decision to invest or making a policy. So there are three methods through which the GDP is calculated. One is income, the other is expenditure, and the third one is production. So whatever method you adopt, the GDP figure, it should be same. So the outcome calculated out of these three methods, the GDP should be same, because one person's income may be the expenditure for the other person's. So there are two GDPs, one is nominal GDP, the other one is real GDP. Nominal GDP is the price of the goods based on the current prices prevalent in the country, whereas the real GDP is where the inflation is factored into it. So normally the normal GDP is, if it is $10 trillion, the real GDP may not be $10 trillion, it may be either 7 or 6 trillion dollars. So there are two, three other indicators related to GDP. So the GDP growth rate, it's being calculated, and also the per capita GDP. So the GDP divided by the population of the country. So in a country, the GDP may be looking very attractive, but if you divide the GDP by the population, the per capita will be very, very small. For GDP calculation, the trade surplus or deficit is also being factored. The trade surplus or deficit arises when export is more than the import, then the country is having surplus. When the imports are more than the export, the country is having deficit. So trade surplus will add positive for GDP, whereas the deficit trade will be the negative dampener for the GDP. And in GDP, basically the investment in a country and also expenditure incurred by the country, whether it is private expenditure or government expenditure, is being factored to arrive at the GDP. So the nominal and real GDP, which we already discussed, to arrive the real GDP from nominal GDP, the deflator is being used. So to calculate the real GDP from the nominal GDP, the deflator is being used. Most probably the deflator is the consumer price index being used to arrive at the real GDP. When we spoke about the per capita GDP, the GDP of the country may be looking very good, but considering the population, if the population is large, then the GDP may not be very attractive for the particular country. In India, for example, our GDP is close to $3 trillion, but in terms of per capita, because our population is 1.3 billion, so the GDP figure is $2,170, whereas in United States of America, which is having a GDP of close to 21 trillion dollars, so the per capita GDP is 63,000 US dollars. The formula for GDP is consumption, it's equal to private spending plus government spending, whatever money spent by government, along with the investments, add with all these things, the exports, and reduce the import, you will get the GDP for a particular year. And in consumption, it is decided by the consumer confidence and the buying behavior of goods and services. If more people are buying more amount, then the GDP of the country will grow up, and the government spending is equal to the government money spent on infrastructure and also equipments and salary and pension and so many other areas. The government will spend a lot of money. If the government is spending a lot of money, then GDP also will grow up. Investment is very important component of the GDP. So it is the private investment which increases the productive capacity in the country and which creates the job creation. So if the jobs are more, definitely the income also will be more. So these people, the whatever they earn, they will be spending more. It's a cycle. It's a vicious or virtuous cycle. It depends upon the growth projections or the amount spent by the private people on the various growth areas, which creates job opportunities. Then the exports are being added and the imports are being reduced. Trade surplus and deficits already we discussed. So this is a cycle of GDP in a country where investments lead to jobs, more investment and more jobs means more income available in the hands of the people, and more income means these people will be spending more amount. So it will be more consumption. If more consumption, then the private investments will be more. It's a cycle. So Robert Kennedy is the brother of Mr. John Kennedy. In the 1968, he made a very important statement. GDP is a very important indicator which measures everything, but it is not making the life worthwhile. So his statement is very famous, and it is instigating the minds of people to find alternate ways of GDP and whether GDP is actually helping the country to improve the standard of living of the people. Some of the news appeared in Guardian. It's the time to end our fixation with GDP and growth. So it's the GDP should come out of the economic planning of the country, and they should think about alternate ways, and they should think about other priorities and which is more sustainable in nature. In Canada, they are ready to ditch the GDP as a key prosperity indicator. In New Zealand, they have taken a new way of announcing the budget, which is the well-being budget, and this is the first of its kind. In the 2019 they tried this. Economic Times, there is an article on the shifting the policy from GDP towards improving the development of the people by various development indicators, and which is long overdue. It has to be carried out. And why GDP is no longer the most effective measure of economic success. And in India, there is a lot of difference between its wealth and its GDP, and which is a real indicator of the economic arguments. And there are a lot of constructive criticism about using the GDP for going ahead. And there are many countries, they have find new ways of assessing the performance of the country. When GDP is in use from the year 1940, and this terminology was coined by Mr. Simon Kuznets. He's a Russian-born economist. He was the advisor to United States, and he designed this GDP, and also he has indicated the ways through which the GDP can be calculated. And Mr. Simon, he advised the US government during the wartime to assess the country's demand and supply position through GDP. Actually, when this GDP was designed by Mr. Simon, it's not that GDP will be used in the years to come to assess the economic indicator, but it is the specific agenda of Mr. Simon during that particular wartime of the country, US, to assess the demand and supply. So the disadvantage in GDP is it measures the tangibles and which are captured in the monetary terms for the particular financial year. However, this well-being and happiness of the people are out of the scope of GDP, and the assets created are wealth available in the country, and the technology used, the value technology is bringing to the country, like most prominently it's called FANG, this Facebook, Amazon, and also Netflix and Google and Alphabet's company, whatever they contribute, it's all through digital means. This is not captured in the GDP. Mostly the benefits coming out of FANG is all non-tangible, and it is improving the lifestyle of the people, but it is not captured in the GDP. So leisure time, family time, whatever you spend to increase your productivity, this leisure time and family time is increasing the productivity of the employees, but this is not captured in GDP. For increasing the GDP, there are many measures taken by the government which is affecting the environment, though, so that the environmental effects are not considered. Whereas for environmental degradation, the government is doing a lot of expenditure and lot of spending money to improve the environment and ecology because it's already in the very bad situation. However, the money spent on environmental damages are being captured as one of the GDP, and the money spent by people on health, improving their health, and also the sickness also captured as GDP. And there are a lot of assumptions in the GDP, so that also is a disadvantage in calculating the GDP. And the money spent on drugs, drug is a very negative, it's causing a lot of negative effect, but the money spent on drugs and prostitution also captured in GDP. The very important factor which is not captured in GDP is the distribution of income. So for example, money accumulated in only in few hands will increase the GDP, and there are a lot of people very poor and marginalized people, they don't get enough income, that is not captured in the GDP. So if you see the GDP growth of the world from 1960, now currently the world GDP is $92 trillion. So the growth of GDP from 1960 is 5,000 percentage. So even though 5,000 percentage growth in GDP in the world, as on date, half of the world population, which is 3.4 billion population, they are struggling to meet their basic needs. Wealth of the country, which is acquired over a period of time, is not captured because in GDP only the monetary value of the goods and services are captured only for a particular year, whereas the wealth acquired by the people and wealth available in the country is not captured. India, the GDP is 2.9 trillion dollars, and the wealth of the country is 12 trillion dollars. So there is a lot of disparity between the GDP and the wealth. India and China, they are showing the higher GDP growth, whereas the countries which are very prosperous available in the Europe, they show only 1 to 2% of GDP growth, but the countries in the many countries in the Europe are classified as a happy countries. The top countries in terms of GDP are United States of America and China. And United States, the GDP is $20 trillion, whereas in China it's $13 trillion. New Zealand, as I told you earlier, it's the first country to introduce well-being budget in the year 2019. It's the first attempt, but there are other countries also available which is focusing on the well-being and the happiness, like United Kingdom, France, Australia, and Canada and Bhutan. And there are other indicators in addition to GDP, Human Development Index, and Happiness Index, Gender Development Index. But the one disadvantage in calculating the well-being of the country, which New Zealand has taken a lead by announcing the well-being budget, but how to measure the well-being of the people, because these are all the improvement, the soft skill and the mental ability, mental health, and also physical health of the people, how to measure, that's a challenge. And whatever index you adopt, whether it's a GDP or Human Development Index or Happiness Index or any other index, but that index should help the larger section of the people. That should be the aim of any index. So thank you for watching Learn by Choice. Please subscribe to this channel for more and more videos.